All right, what's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in. So you probably heard me talk a little bit about cold water immersion and how it is actually detrimental to strength and muscle growth. So people whose goal is to grow muscle size or increase their strength probably shouldn't do cold water immersion. This has to do with the impact that it has on muscle protein synthesis. Now, sauna, on the other hand, has the same benefits and then some that cold water immersion, but it doesn't have this negative impact on muscle growth and strength, or so it seems. So if we look at endurance training specifically first. Now, cold water immersion has shown to improve certain aspects of endurance. Now, it turns out sauna does the same. So in this particular study, they had participants go through 3 weeks of an endurance training program and either doing 30 minutes of sauna after the training each day or not doing the sauna afterwards. And actually, they did 2 days per week of sauna for an average of 30 minutes each. And they had what's called a washout period in between. So each participant did both legs of that study. They did the training with the sauna afterwards, and they took 3 weeks for a washout where they didn't do either, and then they did 3 weeks of either the control or whichever other one they didn't start with. And so they served as their own control participant. And what they did is they compared pre and post endurance testing on individuals doing the sauna versus not doing the sauna. And they found that when these participants went through the sauna after the training, they had an increase in their time to exhaustion. So how long could they sustain a given exercise program? This is a good indicator of fatigue, which is a great endurance adaptation. And then also a time trial. So how quickly could they achieve a certain distance or outcome? In this case, it was a 5K. Both of those improved. Not only that, but they actually increased plasma and total blood volume. So they got more blood just from going in the sauna. Now that's a good thing. Having more blood, a greater capability to distribute oxygen to working muscles. This is an adaptation you see with exercise. So having an increase in blood volume would show an increase in these endurance adaptations, and that's what they found. Now, what about strength though? Now, strength adaptations haven't really been studied very well in sauna, and that goes with muscle hypertrophy or muscle growth as well. But when you look into the data a little bit, you can kind of piece together what's going on. First of all, there's no research showing a negative impact on muscle growth and strength adaptations similar to what we see with cold water immersion. And when you look at these independent studies, you can kind of see that there actually may be this benefit. For example, this particular paper here, what they did is an immobilization protocol where they had participants immobilized with their lower body for 10 days. And they looked at if they had heat exposure during that time period versus no heat exposure, what happens within the muscle. So they took a biopsy of a muscle in the lower leg, the vastus lateralis here, and they looked at what's happening in there as far as signaling for protein synthesis and the capability to grow muscle. And the heat exposure, this was with just like a heating pad for 2 hours, they found that it increased what are called heat shock proteins. So heat shock proteins we refer to them as chaperone proteins. They play a role in making sure proteins don't get misfolded, making sure everything's going where it needs to be, making sure that the muscle can go through optimum protein synthesis. They have a role in plenty of other physiological functions, but we're focusing specifically on the impact they have on protein synthesis. So if you can increase heat shock proteins, you're going to see an increase in the capability of the muscle to go through protein synthesis. And that is what they saw here. And not only did heat increase the heat shock proteins, but it actually preserved the size of the muscle. So if you immobilize your muscle, you can imagine you're going to decrease that muscle size, what is called atrophy. So not using your muscle, you'll see muscle size start to decrease. Heat exposure alone preserved the size of that muscle in this immobilization protocol when, 2 hours of this heating pad versus no heat exposure. So we've got this ability to preserve muscle. We've got this increase in heat shock protein, so it's likely that we'll see an increase in protein synthesis. A separate protocol here, a separate study, what they did is they did whole body versus single leg heat exposure, and they used water in this example. And they were testing whether heat on its own could have this impact on muscle protein synthesis. And they also looked at mitochondrial function, specifically mitochondrial biogenesis, or your body's signaling mechanism to create more mitochondria. This is an adaptation you see with both strength and endurance training. And what they found is whole body heat exposure it increased heat shock proteins again. They saw this just like the other study did. So increase in heat shock proteins, which again would indicate increased protein synthesis. And they saw additional protein synthesis pathways, or what we call anabolic pathways, activated with this whole body heat exposure, specifically the AKT-mTOR pathway. So that was upregulated. And then also these signaling mechanisms of mitochondrial biogenesis. So you're seeing just heat on its own impacting the body or muscle's ability to go through protein synthesis. So you can kind of start to piece together that sauna is probably not having this negative impact on muscle growth, protein synthesis that we see with cold water immersion. And in fact, it's likely going to show that it's going to have a positive benefit. And we'll see as more research is done after resistance training specifically. But you know, if your goal is to improve strength, improve muscle size, sauna is probably going to be the way to go versus cold water immersion. Because again, you see similar adaptations with sauna versus cold water. You know, you see that increased mood, you see decreased soreness, you see preserved muscle function in between exercise sessions. You see this enhanced performance across the board, and then you don't see that negative impact that cold water immersion has on growth. So get in the sauna.